I lived in a very quiet rural town when I was younger, and there was only one stoplight, a Safeway, and one gas station with little mum and pop shops in between. I lived 35 minutes out of town on a street with only 5 other people on it, all a good walking distance from each other, meaning that you couldn't see your neighbours out your window. I was only 10 or 12 at the time, and my older brother, who had received his license recently, wanted any excuse to take the car out, and me being an annoying little sister always begged to tag along. I can't remember what he had gone out for, but it was 11:30 at night and we had just turned on our long winding street. I lived in the PNW, so the pine trees, they tower over you and can sometimes give you the feeling of being enclosed. And it was a particularly foggy night, so visibility was pretty limited. So I was looking towards my brother from the passenger seat, not paying any attention to the road, and all of a sudden, my brother slams on his brakes hard enough that I nearly hit the dashboard. I had my mouth open, about to yell at him, when I see his face is petrified with an expression that I just couldn't pinpoint. His lips were pinched together, his nostrils flaring, and I could hear his breathing. His eyes were wide open and locked on like a missile to its target. I finally allowed my eyes to follow his gaze, and in the middle of the street, a low fog on the road, were 2 individuals in black robes with their hoodies on. These robes were the real thing too, just like the Grim Reapers or something, were wider at the opening of the sleeves, and the hood just completely covered their faces so we couldn't see anything. We sit there for what felt like forever, just staring at them in our headlights, and then they just start to walk towards us. At this point, my scared shitless little self had both hands on my brother, shaking his arm violently back and forth, screaming, "Lock the doors." He cries out, I am, and pressing the lock button, we hear the reassuring sound. These people were crawling towards the car though in perfect sync, stepping slowly at the same time. We watched them as they made their way to the front of the car and then make the slight turn as they began walking by the driver's side. My brother and I were stuck in fear, just staring as they walked past us and disappeared into the dark in our rearview mirror. We sped home and freaked out, telling our dad everything, who then called the cops, who reported multiple sightings of these 2 and then instructed us not to confront them. I never heard or saw anything about them again, but I'm pretty sure that they were a part of some cult. When I was a child, from 3 to 6 years old I'd say, my mum moved from Sao Paulo, a huge city in Brazil, to a small town next to Amazonas forest, across the country. She was a single mum with 2 kids, my brother being just a year older than me. We were rich back then and looked rich as well, even though my mum didn't like to show it off, but we always had nice hair and skin. What I mean by this is that rich people look rich even when they don't want to. So, the only asphalt street in the town was the main avenue that connected 2 highways. All the other streets were dirt. There were no apartment buildings in there, so Mum bought a nice blue house to us. The house had a small front yard and a huge backyard with grass and mango and papaya trees. She worked all day, and we went to school in the morning and spent the afternoon just playing with the kids from the neighborhood, with a maid at home to take care of us and all that. Mum arrived in the evening, and then the maid left. One day, my mum woke up pretty late. She didn't hear the alarm clock, and neither did we, the kids. We overslept till noon, and this had never really happened before. My brother always woke up early by himself, still to this day even. She woke up and realized that the entire house was upside down. After waking us up without understanding a thing, my mum went to the kitchen to make breakfast, and then she saw that all the electronics were missing. TV, stereos, even some food and her jewelry and clothes, and everything was just a mess. She then called her brother that lived a few houses away, and until he got there, she made us stay in our room and started to search the site where the house was built. They found out that someone leaked formaldehyde in the air conditioning system. We passed out, and they just entered the house and stole everything that they could. I was 4 years old at the time, and my brother was 5, and I actually remember this pretty clear. There were iron bars on the window, but they had been cut so that they could enter. And now that I'm 30-ish, I think that they could have done whatever they wanted to us, to be honest. They could have raped us, or kidnapped us, killed us, whatever they wanted, really. And the creepiest part is that we lived there for 2 more years after that. Two years ago, right around Halloween in fact, I was babysitting for these 2 ladies who each had a son. They wanted to go out, so I stayed at one of their houses and watched their boys. It was around 8 p.m. I'd say, and the boys were sitting on the couch just playing on their iPads and whatnot when somebody knocked on the door. I asked them if anyone was supposed to come over, and they both said no. I go over and check the eye hole in the door, and it's some guy in a grey hoodie, deliberately hunched over so that I can't see his face. And immediately, I'm like, nope, and don't say anything and start pacing around because I don't want to give him any inclination that we're inside. A couple of minutes later, I check outside the little window through the curtains and he's gone. I didn't want to spook the kids anymore, and there weren't any more knocks, so I just kind of let it go as a prank. Cut to a few hours later, and the mum gets back. They ask me how everything was, and I say that the kids were great, but somebody had come to the door. They ask me what time, and I say around 8, and one of the mums starts freaking out and going through her phone. The other one tells me that right around that time, somebody's been making strange phone calls to them on a blocked number. They had disguised their voice and were saying things like, "I can see you through the window." They didn't think it was serious because it just didn't make sense in the context of where they were, but in retrospect, we're almost positive that it was me that he was looking at through the window. They escorted me to my car, and I touched base later, and apparently nothing strange ever happened after that. But I'm just really glad that I didn't open that door, because I have a feeling in my gut that it would have ended really badly. Two years ago, I drove from San Diego to Anza Borrego Desert to solo camp. I had followed a dirt trail that led into the desert where I did some off-roading and sightseeing and whatnot. When it got dark, I decided to just sleep in my truck and get up early to check out Salvation Mountain, which wasn't super far away at this point. Being the middle of the desert in the winter, I kept the truck running off and on. I slept in the bed of my truck, which had a camper shell in it. I'd basically just wake up when I got super cold and reach in and turn the engine on and let the heater run for a bit. If I'd wake up, I'd just reach in and turn it off. Well, I woke up to what I thought was just a bad dream. My truck was moving. I initially panicked, thinking that I was rolling down a hill or something, but as I stood up, I could see someone driving my truck through the little square window. I freaked, and I laid my head back down and was certain that I wasn't spotted. I didn't want to reveal myself and genuinely feared for my life. I mean, how the fuck somebody was out there was just beyond me. A small part of me wondered if this person was lost and needed help and was in a desperate attempt to just steal a truck to get to safety or something, but I highly doubted that and continued to lay still. He drove it all the way back up the trail that I came in on too, and as soon as he hit the highway, he just floored it. After many, many hellish miles, he parked at a convenience store finally. He left my truck running, and I watched him get out and light up a cigarette, and he paced towards the end of the store, and I got out and jumped up front and nearly peeled out in reverse. I drove across the street and called 911 and kept my eyes on him, and he took off running, and after giving chase in my truck, I lost him near a trailer park. I called the police again and let them know, but who knows if they found him. I ended up in a random-ass town off the highway, and it was the freakiest moment and feeling that I've ever experienced. Oh, and if you're wondering, I didn't lock my truck because I would have locked the keys inside my truck. But to sleep in my camper shell, I have to walk around the truck and climb in through the tailgate. So to stay warm, I just kept the keys in the ignition so that I could periodically reach in through the small square window into the cab and just turn the truck on and off. But let me tell you, I could just barely reach the keys in the ignition through that small window. I kept them in there to avoid dropping the keys too in the cab and therefore just locking myself out. This happened to me when I was a kid, 10 to be exact. I grew up in a military family and lived in the Middle East for a significant portion of my life. Because of this, we frequently traveled to different countries because of the low cost and proximity. On this particular vacation, we flew into Cairo, Egypt for a long weekend. We only lived like 2 or 3 hours away at this point. It was late at night and we were staying in the Marriott Hotel, which had a taxi or shuttle service that was supposed to pick us up. But for some reason, our driver just never showed those, so we were forced to find a regular taxi to take us there, which took forever to find that late at night. But we finally found one, though, that was offering us a pretty good deal. They don't run by meters there. Instead, they just kind of give flat rates that they choose. And we just headed towards the hotel. Out of nowhere, though, another taxi basically T-bones us in the middle of the road, causing us to stop. There aren't really defined roads in a lot of Arab places, so it isn't really that surprising that we got hit. And in very typical nature for the nation, the two drivers get out of their cars, each yelling that it was the other's fault and looking like they were going to throw hands or something. Eventually, they got back into their respective taxis and parted ways. My family and I were completely taken aback. We had been in Egypt less than 2 hours at this point and had already had quite the adventure. We finally get to the hotel, exhausted because it must have been 3 a.m. by this point. Our driver helped us get all of our bags out and get settled and told us that he felt so bad about the car accident that he offered to pick us up the next morning and take us to the Great Pyramids, which was on our agenda anyway for a super cheap rate. My parents agreed and decided on a time for him to come, though I can't remember when. Flash forward to the next morning and everyone's ready for the day, excited to see how crazy it was going to be. Our driver was outside just waiting for us, leaning against the car like someone in an old movie, right when he said that he'd be there. I'm a blonde-haired, blue-eyed girl that had a deep tan at the time, and being in Egypt, that was a pretty rare sight. When the driver saw me in the daylight, he gave me the creepiest, most unsettling look that just sent chills down my spine, even as a 10-year-old. I knew then, too, that something just wasn't right with him. Nonetheless, we got into his taxi and headed towards the pyramids. He continued to try and talk to me and joke around with me the whole ride, too. Something that I found to be pretty creepy, mind you, and bold since both my parents were in the car, too. We get super close and there's an entrance that people can go through and walk the long distance to the pyramids, and there is an entrance that taxis can go through too. You have to pay to see them. Strange, but true. And our driver keeps making jokes about my blonde hair and blue eyes all the time and bringing up that he could get me into the pyramids for free, so my parents wouldn't have to pay the extra ticket price, that is. But we laughed it off and my parents paid him and said thank you and began to exit the taxi. I don't remember how it happened, but at some point after I got out of the car, he did too and directed me towards his trunk. I was confused and thought that we had forgotten something, so I stayed behind as my parents walked towards the gate to get whatever I thought that we had left. The driver pops the trunk, but there wasn't anything in it. And then he grabbed my arm and put a hand on my back, trying to push me into the trunk, and said, "I'm getting you in for free," over and over again as I resisted. And naturally, I freaked out and screamed out to my mum and my dad at the top of my lungs, and I was just terrified. But when they heard me and noticed that I wasn't behind them, they started sprinting back towards the car. But when the driver heard me scream, he immediately let go of me, closed the trunk, and just drove away just as my parents started to run to me. I was crying my eyes out, terrified out of my mind, knowing that this taxi driver tried to put me in his trunk and drove away the second that I screamed for help. It's really scary to think what could have happened to me had he been stronger or more prepared or something, or perhaps faster even. He's still the reason, too, that I'm still terrified of taxis, Ubers, Lyfts, and any sort of car service of that nature. So I was browsing Reddit the other day and I found a story about Lower Valley Pike. I knew when the author gave the location that it sounded familiar, so I Google mapped it and I'd actually been around there at some point. And turns out that around that area is home to a good deal of weird stuff. None of this happened to me, but to my wife, and these are her experiences that she shared directly with me. So my wife went to college in the area of the Link Post and has her own unsettling stories about those years. In the Link Post, the author mentions all of the cars on the streets with all the doors wide open, and that beats anything that she's ever told me as far as creep level, but when I relayed that story to her, she wasn't surprised at all and said that the whole place always just made her feel uncomfortable. So her school was shy of 15 to 20 minutes from the road mentioned in the Link Post, Lower Valley Pike. The school was an extremely strict and a total dry campus. Cigarettes and alcohol would get you expelled on the first offense. The RDs and the RAs were sent out to the typical places people would try and hide in order to bust people too. For this reason, she and her friends would go a good distance away to do their partying and whatnot. The area is and was pretty remote, and there's a good deal of a scenic wooded area, so at 10 or 20 minutes into, that felt further away than it was, but the distance was worth it because, nobody wants to be expelled over a pack of Virginia Slims, if you get my drift. Well, obviously I have no explanation for the Link Post. The things that she told me are more along the lines of humans being the real monsters, such as animal sacrifices, finding makeshift altars with children's things on them and someone's blood, explicit things done to baby dolls, and things hanged from trees that obviously just didn't belong there. She says that Clifton, Ohio and the surrounding area was always just eerie at night, and said that in the late fall, things just got downright unsettling. Once, on one of these trips into BFE for some Boone's farm, she walked away from a group of friends to pee and found a large garbage bag full of domestic-type animals, dogs and cats that had no signs of injuries other than they had their throats cut and blood drained almost completely. My wife has hunted and is familiar with the idea that big game needs to have the blood drained so it doesn't spoil the meat, but said that nobody was going to eat these animals, and she also informed me that that practice is unnecessary. Needless to say, this was enough to freak out a typical group of college girls. Another time, she came across a large plastic rubber-style baby doll that, again, had its throat slit, was naked, and had a hole cut in its genital region and stuffed with things. She said in a number of times in her 4 years in that area that they came across a decent-sized fire set just in the middle of the road randomly. She said that there'd be no reason for them to be there either. No house nearby, just a wood fire on asphalt. One year, she volunteered to help clean for people in the area as a part of a large service project. She and a friend went to one house, and she says that she experienced a complete feeling of just utter dread the whole time that she was there with no explanation. Just that pit of your stomach feeling, like something is bad, and every part of her body was just screaming to get away from there. She didn't see anything or have any odd occurrences while there, just that the whole place felt bad and the woman of the house was really weird. And when I asked her to elaborate on weird, she couldn't. My wife says that she always assumed that it was some kind of Satanist stuff the whole time, and a few of her friends actively went out looking for creepy things after they came across them, the first few times anyway, but she said that she never did because everything she saw made her feel sick and she didn't want to find more. I didn't know my wife when she was in college, and so I've asked her to take me and show me around, tell me stories, take me to local places, and she has, once. She showed me her dorm and all that type of stuff, and on the way, there out in the middle of nowhere, was a random house with things hanged in a tree that were not decorations. The kids' toys, maybe? I'm not too sure, but I told her to pull over and asked if she saw it, and she just kept going and said, "Don't look at it, just ignore it. We don't want to know." We only live an hour or so away, but she doesn't really like to go back and spend any time on or around campus. She doesn't like to talk about this stuff, and based on that reaction, I can tell that She was really shaken by it all. I was 21 at the time, a college scholarship athlete, and looking for a great time after a team win. This took place in 2014, and my football team had just got back from a dub at an away game, amped up that we were ready to hit the town and celebrate with our school. This was a small town where students would have parties and townies. But people from the town that just didn't want to attend our school would show up sometimes. No biggie, we just wanted to drink anyway. So I got a word from one of my teammates that we were having a party, and to my delight, he lived 2 blocks away. I show up fashionably late, half tipsy from pre-gaming, and start enjoying myself. This was a football player's house, my teammate, and when he throws a party, everybody comes. But there were a few townies there too, but not a noticeable amount, and this house was packed though. I mean, our football team alone is 200 guys strong, and about 150 of them were there. I was making my way through the kitchen, and I bumped into this guy. Now, remember that we were packed like sardines in there, but this townie did not take too kindly to me making my way through. He shoved me hard, and me being tipsy, pushed him back, still in game time mode. It's important for me to note too that I was actually a pretty fearless guy up to this day. I've gotten into my fair share of youthful trouble and fights, and I was ready to go, if you know what I mean. So he started talking about watch where you're going, don't you see me here, yada yada yada. We got into each other's face, and it was about to go down in his kitchen. His friends and 2 townie chicks started pulling him away, and I was held back by my teammates. And by this time, all eyes were on us. And by all eyes, I mean all 40-ish people in the kitchen within earshot, because the music was thumping. Reminder that this is my teammate's house, so this guy gets kicked out of the door along with his townie friends, and they were way outnumbered. But the whole way out of the door, he's yelling that I'll see you when I see you, and all that type of shit. I'm like, okay, whatever, and get back to my after-game business trip of drinking and drinking some more. 3 hours pass, and the party starts to die down, and I'm totally lit, and I'm ready to bounce at this point. I live right around the way, so I slink out the door and start the 2-block walk back to my house. I'm halfway down the street from my house, and all of a sudden, a white SUV cuts across the middle of the road with the headlights on me. I'm alone now, and far enough away from the party house that I can't see anyone, and still a block away from my house. He opened the driver door, and who was it that I see? You guessed it, my new buddy that got kicked out of the party. Fuck it. I guess we're about to do this right here then. He opens the door, but I'm blinded by the headlights, and all I hear is this, a round being loaded into a chamber, and then, what do you got to say now, huh? He's about 5 steps from me now and runs up and puts the gun up to my forehead. I was tipsy and kind of really in the moment, and I can't really say what I thought about anything specific at this moment, but I was more so just going from, okay, we're about to duke it out, to, shit, that's a real gun, isn't it? And it was. Old dumbass drunk me, too, says, oh, so you're going to shoot me now? Well, his pistol was literally on my forehead. He stood there for a few seconds and said, nah, and then attempted to hit me with the pistol in my head. As soon as it moved away from my head, I grabbed that hand and we started fighting right there in the middle of the street. I got a few blows in, and he got a few blows in, and the gun was dropped, and I finally got him into what was somewhat of a lock. I had him stuck, basically, and this is when I remembered that there were other figures in the car that I could vaguely make out, and I think it was the 2 chicks, and they just sat there and watched this whole incident go down. Worried about one of them coming out to grab the gun, I let go of the guy, and he was way out of breath at this point, and I grabbed the gun and dropped out the magazine and tossed the magazine as far as I could. But by this time, the adrenaline was going strong, and I just wanted to get the fuck away from the spot. The guy started standing up and said, I need that, pointing to the gun, and I, being drunk and starting to feel the weight of the situation, said, okay, are you good? Is this done? Wanting to get the situation over with without a cap in my ass as I'm getting away, I emptied the barrel and sure enough, there was actually a round in the chamber, and the fucking safety was off too. Only the Lord knows why I didn't just take off with the gun. I still can't give an answer for that, in fact, and I just wanted to go home, and I was not trying to wait around to call the cops or be there when he realizes the mag is missing. So I give the gun back. Again, I don't know why. I was just in an odd state of shock and compliance, I think. And at this point, I take off till I'm a safe distance away. I know, I wasn't thinking. I just wanted to get away from that spot, and that's all I can say. Anyway, I walk in my door and close it behind me, and my roommate is on the couch playing Xbox, and I just started bawling. The brevity of just how careless I was with my response and the potentiality of what could have happened just hit me like a ton of bricks. He asked me what was up, and all I could say was that I just had a gun put to my head, man. Up until this point, I was pretty much truly fearless. I didn't care about hurting myself, I didn't care about hurting others, and the stupidity of my ignorant, thoughtless response tore me apart. The turmoil of getting a gun pulled on me was not what made the tears roll, though. I mean, I had just given another human a choice about whether I lived or die. And my greatest blessing in the world was only born 3 months prior to my beautiful daughter. Why didn't I think of her? I almost got shot. And what for? To be honest, I was completely ashamed of myself, and I felt like I turned my back on my daughter in that moment. I was ashamed that everything I worked for in my life, I just put up for grabs for a split second. I called this guy's bluff and won the hand, but did I really win? I wouldn't say so. In the end, I don't go out like I used to, and it was the last time I drank in that manner too. I don't believe that the alcohol was a factor in the lead up to the situation, but it sure did lend to my careless response, that's for sure. I never knew real fear until the thought of my daughter being fatherless flashed in my mind after, and that could have been my reality and hers that night. And I left that decision up to a drunk stranger that I pissed off. Not long ago, my partner and I were driving through reservation land at about 11 o'clock at night, in the desert southwest of the USA. We were on a major highway, but as with so many highways in that area, it's not very well used, just barely paved, and with only one lane going in each direction. There were no lights, just reflectors embedded in the pavement too, and it's not uncommon to go for an hour on this highway without seeing another vehicle. I was reading a book aloud when suddenly my buddy who was driving interrupts and pulls off on the side of the road, braking quickly. "Hey man, did you see that?" No," I replied. "See what?" "The van. It went off the road." I turned in my seat, but couldn't make out anything, on or off the road. It was just darkness all around, and he grabbed the flashlight that we keep in the car and asked me to call 911. He's in a medical profession and a lapsed licensed EMT, and I've worked in an emergency response kind of unit, so this isn't a super uncommon occurrence for us, although not even being able to see the accident was a first for me. I got on the phone with 911 immediately and set about trying to find a mile marker using my phone as a flashlight, eventually settling for giving them approximate GPS coordinates as I had very little coverage and my GPS was acting flighty in that area. The dispatcher asked me to cross the highway carefully and try to ascertain the status of the passengers since they had gone straight over a hill and presumably into the canyon below. I stayed on the line while I trudged over the sand dunes on the opposite side of the highway. I was a bit nervous to be walking in this area in sandals as we had just recently been discussing the rattlesnake population in the region and I couldn't really see where I was going and answer the dispatcher questions at the same time. But the scrubby vegetation gave me some purchase and finally I crested the largest dune and could see the outline of the accident site. On the road, the moonlight was blocked by the dunes, but on this side, it was strangely bright. It took my brain a moment to make sense of what I was seeing. They had been lucky, to be honest. The van had turned on its side as it slid, and the friction from the dunes had just barely prevented the entire thing from going straight over the edge into the massive canyon below. My partner called out to me and asked me to check on the woman in the van, and I saw that next to him, standing with a scarecrow-like stiffness, was a young man. He looked dazed and didn't seem to be answering many questions, and I got the darkest vibe off of that guy that I've ever encountered. I felt goosebumps just crawling up my back, and it was just like there was a permanent ring of shadow around him or something. I felt really uneasy knowing that either of us were anywhere near him, and made a point to give a visual checking up on him. I proceeded to the site and around the van and called out to identify myself. I heard the voice of a woman inside, and as I walked around to the windshield, I could see her. She was crouched in the passenger cabin, clearly in shock, her feet bleeding as she shifted back and forth in the broken glass of the driver's side window. She was a tall, willowy woman, thin and pale with dark hair. There was also a massive wolfhound panting. It appeared equally stunned, and I saw that they had managed to pry the passenger side door open, and the man must have climbed out through the top that way. But the woman spoke with me for a time, calmly and with an urgency that I couldn't quite identify in her voice, and I relayed the information to the dispatcher. Yeah, it was just the two of them. No, they don't seem to be seriously injured. No, nobody's fallen asleep at the wheel or anything. They were on their way to Texas, apparently, to visit family. They were living out of the van, I think. What I remember most clearly is that I made a couple of attempts to convince her to either climb out of the roof or through the back to clear away from the van just to be safe. But she politely refused each time. She said that she didn't want to leave the dog. And there was just something really wrong about her demeanor. People react differently to stress, and she seemed alert and competent, so I just kind of put it to the back of my mind, though, but I kept being struck by a strangeness in her handling of the situation, if that's the right words. Dispatch and I agreed that the paramedics could probably easily break the windshield to free them, and there was no sign of fuel, so it was fine for her to stay in there until they arrived. Once I double-checked that she was secure and wasn't going anywhere, I handed off the phone to my partner while I went out to wave in the paramedics, who had accidentally passed the site and were backing towards us from farther up the highway, looking for our flashlight thanks to the dispatcher. They pulled off a ways up from the site, and I began to brief them when we all heard dispatch come over the radio. They said to us, "Please be advised that the male passenger is AMS and considered dangerous." AMS stands for Altered Mental Status, suggesting that someone isn't in the normal frame of mind or for a variety of reasons. But we all stopped in our tracks, and the paramedics exchanged a glance, and one went back to the ambulance for additional equipment. I was eager to get back to my partner to make sure that he hadn't communicated that to the dispatch out of concern for his safety, but when we arrived on site, they were still talking quietly. I went to my car to find shoes for the woman, and the passengers were placed in the different ambulances, and the police arrived to take interviews all around. Just as we were about to leave, an officer, taking our statements, turned to us and said, "Yeah, well, it's pretty messed up. I guess she was driving and he wanted to kill them both, so he grabbed the wheel and overpowered her. It's lucky that either of them are alive, in fact." After a couple of hours, when we were back to driving, my partner proceeded to fill in the details. So when we first got to the scene, the woman was yelling that he had tried to kill her and not to leave her alone with him. She also said that if she got out, that he needed to be restrained as he was a danger to himself and others. The man was very eager to be out of the vehicle, and bewildered, my partner had nonetheless helped the guy pry the door open, and once he was out, the guy had just clammed up and wouldn't do much more than nod or shake his head in response to questions. He kept thinking that the guy might take off and get lost in the desert or something, but in the end he just waited there. He said that the guy had seemed agitated, so he was doing his best to keep him engaged and distracted until help could arrive. It was honestly chilling to realize that what we had thought was an accident was actually a a murder-suicide attempt. I really wanted to accompany the woman to the hospital, but for unrelated reasons, we just couldn't remain. We went back that way during the day on our return trip a week later, though, and we pulled over at the site and climbed over the dunes to see whether they had managed to tow the van over all that sand. And, sure enough, it was gone. What was unnerving, though, was the realization, upon seeing the landscape during the day, that if he had chosen any other spot to grab the wheel for miles in both directions, they would have been over a cliff almost immediately. In the dark, there was no way for him to tell, but he had chosen the only spot where they realistically could have survived the accident. My partner then told me that they had gone off the road when they were nearly opposite our little sedan on the highway, and if the guy had opted for a head-on collision instead of the off-the-cliff option, he would have been toast. And quite honestly, it was a sobering thought. I think of that woman that I met that night often, and of her wolfhound being gingerly coaxed into the back of a police car. I really hope that they're in a much better place now. As for that guy who tried to kill them all, I certainly hope that he gets help and that we never have cause to see that guy again.